Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser with Stacy Herbert. And time to welcome Nick Giambruno to the show for this Christmas week special. Nick was at Casey Research for a long time, but he started his own company focused on helping people to see the big economic and geopolitical picture to survive and thrive the changes ahead, Stacy.
Right, Nick Giambruno, welcome to the Keiser Report. It's almost New Year's Eve, and we're looking ahead to 2022. This is your business. This is what you do. You look at the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the world, and you plan ahead, right? You make sure that you're not caught up in the whirlwind of chaos and disaster and currency crisis. So, Hemingway he was the one that coined the phrase that, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly and then suddenly. So in terms of the last time you interviewed with Max, you mentioned that, yes, the U.S. is going to go bankrupt. So are we almost in that sudden period of the U.S. going bankrupt? Because we've seen people like Michael Burry, we've seen people like, major big hedge funds are predicting the same thing happening. Do you see that happening in 2022, or are we getting there?
First of all, it's great to be with you, Max and Stacy. And yes, I think we are getting there. And I like to put things into context. When you hear, I think the biggest word that people toss around and they don't really appreciate is the word trillion. How do people really appreciate how big a trillion is? I'll give you an example. 1 million seconds ago was, perhaps 12 days ago. 1 billion seconds ago was about 1990. 1 trillion seconds ago, though, if you started counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get to 1 trillion, you would have had to have started in around 30,000 BC. That's an incredibly large number. So when you see them willy-nilly printing and spending trillions, you're getting into Zimbabwe territory, you're getting into Weimar Germany territory, you're getting into Venezuela territory. So nobody can predict the timing on this, but that doesn't really matter that much. You want to get the big picture right. You don't want to listen to these fools that tell you inflation is a good thing or don't worry, it's transitory. You want to get the real big picture, and the real big picture is that we're headed towards a disaster, quite frankly, and you want to prepare for that.
Right. You mentioned it's hard to get the timing right. But, you have an interesting story because you've lived in Argentina, you've lived in Lebanon. Both of these places have undergone collapse and hyperinflation. So you're in a unique position to kind of give us a taste of what are some of the warning signs, both obvious and less obvious. I'm sure there's some subtle signs as well where things are changing. What are your on-the-ground observations telling you?
Yes. And I think a big warning sign, I consider this an imminent warning sign, is you've heard the saying, don't believe anything until it's officially denied. So when you hear government officials, bankers come up on TV and say, oh, don't worry, your bank deposits are fine. Oh, don't worry, we're not going to take your money. We're not going to devalue the currency. That's an imminent warning sign. If you're seeing that, you've got hours basically to take action. Seen that in Lebanon, seen that in Argentina, we saw it in Cyprus, you see it in a lot of places. That is a very clear warning sign. So watch for that. But also, like I was saying too, if you are confident about the end game, about the big picture, act on it. Nobody was trying to play the Lebanese lira or play the Argentine peso. Is it going to collapse tomorrow? Once you understood that it's going to collapse, you make your move. Don't wait, because it's not going to matter if you're a day or two early. You just don't want to be 1 hour late.
Right after the last time Argentina devalued their currency by 50%, right before the pandemic, Max and I arrived there right after, and we just assumed, knowing only our Western world, that everybody would be and it would be total chaos, right? People would be panic stricken and stuff like that. But it was remarkably calm. So Argentina is kind of ahead of the game in that they've already had so many crises that they know not to trust the system. They know to prepare and take care of themselves. So, where do you see that going? What's the panic state? If the reserve currency, the US dollar, that's never happened in world history of the reserve currency hyperinflating. What do you think that looks like?
Yeah, that's scary. But first, what you're commenting on is that culturally, Argentines are way more resilient to this. We know folks who have lived through four, not one, two, or three, but four hyperinflations. That's incredible. So it's not that it's not painful. I'm not minimizing the pain that people suffer from inflation, but it's not unfamiliar. It is definitely unfamiliar to Americans. If they had a hyperinflation, I mean, just look, people are killing each other over toilet paper shortages. If there's a real crisis, culturally, it's going to be completely different. But yes, you're right. We've never seen the world reserve currency hyperinflate and really have extreme inflation. We're in uncharted territory. This is new because previously the world reserve currencies were based on gold, gold or a derivative of gold. And now we're in totally uncharted territory. But nonetheless, that's the way things are going. So this is going to be global, and in particular, it's going to be focused on the US.
All right, well, it looks like we're setting up for a three-way showdown in the post-hyperinflationary apocalypse. And that's going to be Bitcoin, gold, and central bank digital currencies, all shooting it out at the monetary OK corral to see who wins. Who's the Wyatt Earp in this situation, Nick Giambruno? Who wins?
Yes, I think, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, clearly are not going to win. They are the same fiat scam in a new shiny bottle. It just makes inflation more feasible. I know there's a lot of hullabaloo about CBDCs, but in the end, it's the same fiat scam. And if fiat isn't practical now, it certainly is going to be practical then with this digital currency like that. So nonetheless, I'm not too worried about CBDCs because I think they're impractical for that reason. The main event, the heavyweight title fight is going to be between gold and Bitcoin. Nobody knows how this is going to shake out, but for the first time in history, gold has something that is a legitimate challenger to it. It's never had a legitimate challenger. Silver was never really a legitimate challenger to gold, but Bitcoin is because and as we've discussed before, the most important characteristic, in my opinion, of a good money is resistance to inflation. In other words, that's what hardness is. It's hard to produce. Bitcoin is about as hard to produce as gold, as measured by the stock to flow ratio. In 4 short years, Bitcoin is going to be double as hard as gold. That is going to be, we're going to really see that. It could happen sooner. Bitcoin is already, Bitcoin's market cap isn't encroaching on gold's. All Bitcoin needs to do is go up, a multiple of where it is now, which it has done many times before. So Bitcoin is closing in on gold. Where gold's real weakness was in its portability. And you couldn't move it around easily. That's why it was centralized. Governments were able to centralize it and control it. But Bitcoin is digital and it's backed up by unbreakable encryption. That is not possible. There's not going to be like there was in the 30s where there was a gold confiscation and the government just got all the gold. That's going to be infinitely more hard with Bitcoin. So the real main event fight is Bitcoin and gold. I don't know what's going to happen. Bitcoin has a real shot at dethroning gold. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but it's for the first time in gold's history, it has a real challenger.
Well, let's stick on this CBDC for a moment because, again, your experiences are in Argentina, Lebanon. One thing you always see with the hyperinflation, the collapse, you saw it in Venezuela, is first they knock some zeros off the currency overnight, thus devaluing your savings if you have it in the bank account. And then if that doesn't work, then they shut the banks. They just prevent you from even going there. So in a way, it seems like the CBDC will be the equivalent in our Western world. It's more like technological and modern, and it's more gamified. It's like, hey, look, yeah, you don't have those, that you had $100,000 in your savings account. Well, now you have 500,000 of these digital dollars, like these new CBDCs. You should feel wealthy, right? Do you think that might be something that we see coming up?
Yeah, they're going to try all sorts of tricks and gimmicks, but the bottom line is this. I mean, think of it like this. If Venezuela implemented a CBDC, would that bolster the bolivar? If Lebanon introduced a CBDC, would that bolster the lira? It's there's a lot of hype around these things, and they are scary. They can track and control everything that you do, spend, earn, save, so forth. They can cut you off. They can limit your cash. They can say, oh, your cash disappears after a day. They can do all sorts of crazy stuff, but what they can't do, here's the one thing they can't do. They can't make you value it. They cannot give it at value. So if they have these CBDCs. Do you suppose they're going to stop printing $120 billion a month? I don't think so. They're going to ramp up the printing presses. So they're going to devalue these currencies even faster with CBDCs. And that is not going to save the value of them. People value things, they subjectively value things. All value is subjective. So they're going to look at things, at monetary goods that hold their value, that aren't going to be debased, that aren't going to be inflated. So I'm personally not worried about these CBDCs because I don't think they're practical.
Right. Well, they clearly want to go in the direction of negative interest rates, which is the same thing as to say subscription money, where it has a time where it elapses, like a frequent flyer mile. So the US dollar will be replaced with a digital dollar, and if you don't spend it in 6 months, it expires worthless. That type of thing is coming to the world of fiat money. They're simultaneously trying to increase the surveillance state by looking at every transaction that exceeds $600, which is to say all transactions. So they're trying to corral the population into a game where that's not fun and everyone loses. So do you think that Bitcoiners will successfully secede from this?
Yes, I do, because what I see is grandiose ambitions that aren't matched by something they can really do. You know, it reminds me when they introduced all these, cash disclosures back in the 60s and the 70s, they had, $10,000. That was the limit. You had a transaction over $10,000 in cash. You're carrying more than $10,000 in cash. You've got to report it. And inflation has whittled that away completely. So it's almost meaningless. And so basically, and $600, my gosh, they basically want to surveil everything. However, they are going bankrupt. In these countries, like I said, I spent a lot of time in Argentina. A lot of politicians here, they have grandiose, if they had the capital, they have grandiose schemes, but they're bankrupt. So when the U.S. government is bankrupt, and it's going to hit a wall sooner or later. This goes back to what we were talking about before. We know the end game. We know the big picture of where this is ultimately going. I don't know how long it's going to take. Nobody knows how long it's going to take. But regardless, if they're able to try to set up this like digital prison planet around your finances, it's not going to, in my opinion, it's not going to change the end game. So opt out of the system. Don't let it scare you. Opt out of it. There are real alternatives now. You don't need to be scared of this. These people are crazy and evil, but you can opt out of their system. Buy Bitcoin. You can buy gold, but Bitcoin is the main way to do it. And you don't have to participate in this.
Oh boy, this sounds good. We're going to take a break and come back and talk about Bitcoin citadels with Nick Giambruno. Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser with Stacy Herbert. Happy holidays. We got a great guest here, Nick Giambruno. We're talking about the showdown between Bitcoin, gold, and central bank digital currencies as we head into the new year. Who's going to win that one? I think we know the answer about Bitcoin. Let's talk about Bitcoin citadels, Nick. This is something you see on Bitcoin Twitter all the time. You got the Bitcoiners saying, we're building our citadels, essentially, like an Ayn Rand novel, right? It's, who is John Galt? This idea that, we're just going to secede. We're going to start our own communities away from the Keynesian madhouse. Do you think this is going to work? I mean, actually, there have been a couple of attempts in the Bitcoin community to do this over the past 10 years. So far, they haven't worked, but will this work? Do we move to a city-state model in the future? Where do you see this going, Nick?
Yes, and I think this plays into a broader trend, which is the death of the nation state. Where this system, that started, I think, about 400 something years ago with the Treaty of Westphalia that created the modern nation state. I think that is a trend that is happening. This is disintegrating. What is going to come next? And I think something that could come next is something that was in the old science fiction book, The Diamond Age, which is something called files. In other words, you're going to find people grouped together who are like-minded and have the same interests and are passionate about the same thing. And I think we're seeing this already start to happen with Bitcoiners. And that is where the citadels are going to play in. So yes, I think we are moving. I think this is a long-term trend. This is a big trend. This is not going to happen happen tomorrow, but I think we're seeing the nation state lose its power over people. I mean, frankly, people who live in, look at the U.S., for example. Just because you have a blue passport doesn't mean you share the same values or interests as somebody else who has a blue passport. So I think people are going to naturally migrate to the people who have the same values as they do. And Bitcoiners, by and large, share a lot of the same values in terms of just the basic stuff, how their ethics are, how they view work, and so forth. So I think you're already seeing Bitcoiners come together and talk about this. So I think it plays into this broader trend, and I think it is a very real possibility.
It's interesting because, you've seen in the lead up to the end of this year, you've seen that desire amongst the American population. Polls show that, they basically want to split off into red and blue areas. But within this whole nation state thing, you have globalization where capital is just free to go wherever they want, wherever it best is treated. Whereas humans have been more and more and more restricted in terms of where they're allowed to go, which is the exact opposite of most of human history. The first several tens of thousands of years, we just traveled wherever we wanted, and maybe capital was more restricted. But on top of this, you also have the civilizational model, right? So you have civilizations like the Chinese civilization rather than a nation state, really, in the sort of Western sort of system. So how do we get to that point? I see the individuals, I see the Bitcoiners wanting to set up the citadels and a city-state model. And certainly I could see the people of New York City or Manhattan to be totally happy. They would love to have their own city-state. But how does power relinquish, right? They never give up power willingly. How does the military industrial complex of these various nation states around the world, how does that dissolve or disintegrate?
Yeah, it's going to be bankruptcy. That's what's going to do it, or losing a war. I go back to Argentina because I think Argentina is such a terrific example for this stuff. So how does the Argentine central government? Yeah, it controls the airport, but it really doesn't have much writ outside of Buenos Aires. But what happened? Well, they lost the Falkland Islands War. That gutted the Argentine military, from which it would never recover, and it's had several hyperinflations and bankruptcies since then. That's what's going to do the trick. The same thing happened to the Romans and all other empires. It's happening to the U.S. too. And you got to remember, these are huge long-term trends, and we're just taking a snapshot in time. The important thing is to get the big picture right, because most people don't get the big picture right, and they're focused on their day-to-day stuff. You want to get the big picture right. You don't want to be left behind, and when these historic trends play out. So I think that's what's going to happen. Yes, you're absolutely right. The nation state power is going to have to be broken. And it's going to be broken, I think, through bankruptcy and losing wars, which is clearly happening.
The question about cycles, because I know you study the big picture as you talk about it. You've got the fourth turning, which is the generational cycles, as we've talked about a few times. Then you have the Thucydides trap, which is kind of one power giving way to another power, in this case, the U.S. giving way to China. So you've got, and China, of course, is emerging, and on a purchasing power parity basis, it already is the world's largest economy. In what's left of the legacy system, in what's left of the nation states before they dissolve as we know them, what do you think the final end game is going to be on the nation state level? Well,
the people who run the nation states, it's interesting because they aspire to build, we talk about, more of a global government. They aspire to have this system of NATO, the IMF, the World Bank. This is what the elites of the West clearly wanted, but it's not how it worked out. So instead of moving towards that, we're going to go the other direction, and we're going to see the West get knocked down a peg, more than a peg. I mean, this is huge with China's rise and the collapse of we're talking about the collapse of the US. The EU is obviously on its way out. What is look at the big picture. That is Western civilization getting knocked down and the East rising. This is something that really hasn't happened since the collapse of the Roman Empire. This is huge, huge, huge stuff. But nonetheless, if you look at where the current trends are going, that's what's happening. If you take it to the logical conclusion, that is what's happening, unless something changes that. You're right. We have the Thucydides trap. the U.S. with the dynamic, with the rising power and the dominant power, established power, that is going to be a huge trend that plays out. I hope it doesn't turn into war. It very well could, though.
Let's look at the positive side. Okay, it's almost New Year's Eve. Everybody's ready to party. They want to look forward to 2022 and beyond. So, Max and I lived in Europe for a long time. And one thing you do notice is that in the history books, these were huge empires. They were colonial powers. You talk about Africa, they ran most of Africa and divided it up. Well, when the British Empire is at their peak, they have like Dickensian times, right? Horrible times for the ordinary person. Same in France. You see, prior to World War I, World War II, you had very malnourished people. You have all those fountains around that were donated by a wealthy person because there was so much disease amongst the ordinary people. Even Orwell wrote about a down and out in Paris and London. So, in a post-empire world, it seems like for the ordinary American right now, we're having over 90,000 opioid overdoses a year. That's a death of despair. That's just the opioid overdoses. There's mass suicide. There's all sorts of other indicators of despair. It feels like if our observations of what we've seen in Europe is right, that we could have almost a sort of renaissance should the dollar collapse for the ordinary bottom 99% of the population.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true because, what is happening is the government is suffocating in these places. It's suffocating civilization. It's suffocating the culture. What you described is social and cultural decline. While we can measure financial and economic decline, quantitatively, you can't, social and cultural decline is more of it's not really numerical. You can kind of sense it, but, but it clearly is happening, as you mentioned. But yes, I think in the end of this empire, there is a real chance that there could be a rebirth. I mean, so we're talking about the fourth turning. Who is really going to be responsible for fixing this stuff? It's going to be the millennials and the Zoomers. I'm a millennial. I was born early in the millennial years, early 80s. So but you look at the millennials and Zoomers. Yes, a lot of them are blue-pilled. There's no question. A lot of them are blue-pilled. Most of them are blue-pilled, frankly. But the ones that are red-pilled, they are the hardest working, smartest, most driven people you'll ever meet. And so there is a ray of hope with those millennials and those Zoomers.
Now, tell us about your new website. What's it all about? What services are on offer, Nick?
Yes. Well, my new website is called The Financial Underground at financialunderground.com. And my specialty, my passion has been looking at getting the big picture right, because that is the most important thing. The other stuff is really, details. So my specialty, my area of expertise that I've been doing over the years is getting the right big picture, getting the big picture right on geopolitics, economics, and finance. And now, as we've discussed, this is the most dangerous time in anybody's lifetime. We have a multitude of crises that are coalescing and coming together. So it's essential for people to get that. And that's what I like to help people do.
Right. So what sort of, is it a blog? Is it what sort of services are you offering? Are you just telling you what your own experience? Because this is what you do. You travel all around the world and you have experience of developing nations outside the empire, things like that. So what do people find there?
You're going to find news, my news and analysis of what's going on in the world. It will give you the tools to get the right big picture. And I also offer an advisory where my other specialty is finding proper investments and speculations based on this big picture. And, I've used this to get in early on Bitcoin and Bitcoin related mining companies, other big trends as well. So that is part of it too, is what to do about it. I show people what to do about it with their money, not just with their money and their investments, but in terms of how do I maximize my personal freedom in this environment. So it's kind of encompassing those areas.
Right. Of course, you used to work for Doug Casey, and he was very famous for whereas other people might see chaos, like a collapsing economy, a collapsing currency, and flee, he goes towards them. So I guess looking forward to 2022 and 23 and 24, in the next few years, as Bitcoin hardens, as you mentioned, like it seems like that chaos is going to get bigger. So how long is it going to be before we could head into the disaster zone called America as opportunity?
Well, yeah, it's the old cliche of, the Chinese word for crisis also means opportunity, but it's true. And, you can look at various places that this happens. And in a world with the everything bubble and these insane valuations, this is where you have to look. It's one of the areas you have to look to find real bargains and real investment values. When is it going to happen in the US? Well, I like to typically see light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't really see light at the end of the tunnel yet in the US. The market valuations are still pretty crazy. But yeah, it is headed towards one of those moments, one of those crises. And then it will be time to take a hard look at what you can find value in the US. So yeah, look, if you would have looked at in the 1930s, if you would have bought the dividend aristocrats and maybe they weren't dividend aristocrats, they had cut all their dividends, but they would turn into dividend aristocrats, the big blue chip companies, that would be the time to do it. Now is the time to get out, frankly.
All right. Nick Giambruno from financialunderground.com. Thanks for being on the special Christmas, New Year's Keiser Report special.
Thanks, Max and Stacy. Great to be with you.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report special pre-recorded Christmas New Year's event. Put the economic and monetary financial big picture into context with the legendary Nick Giambruno. Enjoy your New Year's Eve. We'll see you in 2022.